The dawn of May 29, 1453. A young sultan, barely 21 years old, stands before the greatest walls ever built by human hands. Behind him, 100,000 warriors wait in absolute silence. Before him, the thousand-year-old capital of the Roman Empire prepares for its final day. The question that burns in every mind on both sides of those legendary walls is this: can walls that have never fallen, walls that have turned back every army for a millennium, finally be broken? The answer will change the world forever. To understand this moment, we must travel back in time, back to when this conqueror was just a boy, back to the palaces and intrigues that forged the iron will of the man who would reshape history itself. Mehmed was born in Edirne on March 30, 1432. His father, Murad II, ruled the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. But Mehmed's childhood was anything but peaceful. The Ottoman court was a place of Byzantine complexity, where princes learned that survival meant constant vigilance. His mother, Huma Hatun, a woman of uncertain origins, perhaps a slave, perhaps nobility, understood the deadly game of palace politics better than most. She knew that her son's life depended not just on his father's favor, but on his own ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court intrigue. From his earliest years, Mehmed was different. While other princes played, he studied. While they hunted for pleasure, he hunted to master the art of war. His tutors quickly realized they were teaching no ordinary child. The boy consumed knowledge with an appetite that seemed insatiable. He learned Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great until he could recite every battle, every strategy, every triumph and disaster. He read the works of the ancient philosophers, the military treatises, the histories of fallen empires. But more than anything, he studied Constantinople. The great city across the straits had haunted Ottoman dreams for generations. Every sultan before Mehmed had looked at those walls and wondered. The Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, had said that Constantinople would one day be conquered, and the commander who conquered it would be a blessed commander. This prophecy burned in young Mehmed's heart like a sacred fire. He would stare across the waters at the distant domes and towers, and he would dream of the day when the crescent banner would fly above them. But before glory could come tragedy and humiliation. In 1443, when Mehmed was just 11 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the boy's destiny in ways no one could predict. Murad II was tired. Decades of warfare, of political intrigue, of the endless demands of empire had worn him down. He wanted peace. He wanted to retire to a life of contemplation and pleasure. And so, in an act that shocked the empire, he abdicated the throne in favor of his young son. Mehmed became sultan at 12 years old. 12, an age when most boys are still learning the basic arts of warfare, still discovering who they are. And Mehmed was suddenly responsible for an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Aegean to the Black Sea. It was madness. It was impossible. And for 2 years, it was reality. The boy sultan tried his best. He appointed ministers, he held court, he made decisions. But he was a child playing at being a man, and everyone knew it. The Grand Vizier, Kandarli Halil Pasha, a man of the old guard, a conservative who believed in maintaining the status quo, effectively ruled in Mehmed's name. The young sultan chafed under this control, his pride wounded, his ambitions thwarted at every turn. He wanted to prove himself, to show that he was worthy of his position. He wanted to lead armies, to expand the empire, to achieve glory. But Halil Pasha counseled caution, diplomacy, peace. The old vizier believed in managing the empire, not expanding it. He believed in avoiding risks, in maintaining good relations with Christian Europe, in slow, steady, careful governance. Mehmed hated it. Every fiber of his being rebelled against this passive approach. He was descended from Osman, from Orhan, from Murad the Thunderbolt. He was meant for greatness, not bureaucracy. But he was 12, then 13, then 14, and no one listened to a child, even if that child wore the sultan's turban. Then came the crisis that exposed the folly of his early reign. In 1444, a crusader army assembled in Hungary. King Vladislaus III of Poland and Hungary, the voivode John Hunyadi, and various Christian lords decided that the time had come to drive the Ottomans out of Europe once and for all. They saw the child sultan as a weakness to be exploited. They broke their treaties and marched south with fire and sword. The Ottoman forces, without Murad's experienced leadership, were in disarray. Mehmed tried to rally them, but he was a boy commanding men who had followed his father into a dozen battles. They did not trust him. They did not believe in him. And when the Crusader army came, the Ottomans began to panic. In desperation, the ministers sent urgent messages to Murad, begging him to return. The retired Sultan was in Manisa, enjoying his peaceful life away from the burdens of power. But his empire was in danger, and duty called. Murad returned, took command of the army, and marched to meet the Crusaders at Varna on the Black Sea coast. The Battle of Varna in November 1444 was a disaster for the Crusaders and a humiliation for young Mehmed. Murad's tactical genius shattered the Christian army. King Vladislaus was killed, his head mounted on a pike for all to see. John Hunyadi barely escaped with his life. The crusade was destroyed. But for Mehmed, watching from the sidelines as his father saved the empire he had failed to protect, the victory tasted like ashes. He had been found wanting. He had been judged and found inadequate. And everyone knew it. Murad formally took back the throne. Mehmed was sent to Manisa as governor, essentially demoted, his brief and disastrous reign at an end. For the next 7 years, from 1444 to 1451, Mehmed lived in a kind of internal exile. He was still a prince, still the heir, but he was no longer the Sultan. He had failed his first test, and the shame of it burned in his soul like acid. But these years were not wasted. If anything, they were the most important years of his life. Mehmed used his time in Manisa to transform himself. He studied harder than ever. He trained his body until he was as strong as any warrior in the empire. He learned to shoot a bow from horseback, to wield a sword, to endure hardship without complaint. He read every military treatise he could find. He interviewed veterans of his father's campaigns, learning from their experiences. He studied the terrain around Constantinople, had maps drawn, calculated angles of fire for siege weapons, analyzed the city's defenses with an obsessive attention to detail. And he nursed his hatred. Hatred for Kandarli Halil Pasha, who had treated him like a child. Hatred for the old guard who had undermined him. Hatred for everyone who had doubted him, who had found him wanting, who had watched him fail and done nothing to help him succeed. This hatred would become a weapon, a source of strength, a driving force that would propel him to greatness. Mehmed II learned in those years of exile that mercy was weakness, that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, that to rule absolutely, he must be willing to be absolutely ruthless. He also learned patience. He learned to hide his time, to appear humble and obedient while his mind planned and schemed and prepared. He learned to smile at those he despised, to bow before those he intended to destroy. He became a master of dissimulation, showing the world one face while his true thoughts remained hidden behind eyes that revealed nothing. In 1451, Murad II died. He was only 47, worn out by a lifetime of warfare and the burdens of empire. The news reached Mehmed in Manisa. The prince who had failed at 12 was now a man of 19. And this time, there would be no mistakes. This time, he would show the world what he was truly capable of. Mehmed rode to Edirne to claim his throne. The speed of his journey spoke volumes about his character. He did not mourn. He did not delay. He moved with the decisiveness that would characterize his entire reign. The throne was his, and he seized it with both hands. His first act as Sultan shocked the empire and announced to the world that a new kind of ruler had come to power. Mehmed had a younger half-brother, an infant named Ahmed, the son of one of Murad's concubines. By the cruel logic of Ottoman succession, this baby represented a potential threat. Rival factions might rally around him. Civil war might tear the empire apart. Mehmed could not allow it. On his orders, the infant Ahmed was drowned in his bath. The murder of the baby prince sent a clear message. This sultan would let nothing and no one stand in his way. Not family, not tradition, not mercy. He would do whatever was necessary to secure his power and achieve his goals. The old sultan, Murad, had been a warrior but also a man of some sentiment. Mehmed was something else entirely. He was pure will, pure ambition, pure determination forged in the fires of humiliation and failure. His second act was to consolidate his power in the government. He kept most of his father's ministers and generals, at least for now. But everyone understood that their positions depended entirely on their usefulness to the Sultan. Mehmed was watching, evaluating, judging, and those who failed to meet his standards would be removed, one way or another. Kandarli Halil Pasha remained as Grand Vizier. The old man had served Murad faithfully, and his experience and connections made him valuable. But Mehmed had not forgotten the humiliations of his first reign, and Halil Pasha knew it. The vizier counseled caution, urged the new sultan to maintain peace with the empire's neighbors, to consolidate rather than expand. It was the same advice he had given the boy sultan, and Mehmed listened with the same apparent respect. But this time, behind the respectful facade, the sultan was planning something that would make Halil Pasha's caution irrelevant. Constantinople, the obsession of Mehmed's life. The dream that had sustained him through years of exile and humiliation. The city that no Ottoman sultan had been able to take. The city whose walls had broken the armies of Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Turks. The city that stood as the last remnant of the Roman Empire, defiant and seemingly eternal. Mehmed began his preparations immediately, but he did so with such subtlety that at first, few understood what he was planning. He made peace with Venice, with Hungary, with the various Christian powers of Europe. He sent ambassadors with gifts and reassurances. He signed treaties and made promises. All the while, his true attention was focused on the straits, on the city that glittered across the water, on the prize that had eluded his ancestors. The Byzantine Empire was dying. Everyone could see it. The empire that had once stretched from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Mesopotamia, was now reduced to the city of Constantinople itself, a few islands, and some territory in the Peloponnese. The emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, ruled over perhaps 50,000 people within the city walls. His treasury was empty. His army was tiny, perhaps 7,000 men, many of them Italians and Catalans who fought for pay rather than loyalty. His navy consisted of a handful of ships. The great city was a shadow of its former glory, its population declining, whole neighborhoods abandoned, its once great churches falling into disrepair. But Constantinople still had its walls. The Theodosian walls, built 1,000 years earlier by the Emperor Theodosius II, were the greatest fortifications in the world. The land walls consisted of 3 separate defensive lines. First, a moat, 60 feet wide and 22 feet deep. Behind the moat, an outer wall, 27 feet high and 6 feet thick. Behind that, an inner wall of absolutely staggering proportions, 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, studded with 96 towers that rose even higher. These walls ran for 4 miles from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, an unbroken line of stone that had turned back every assault for a millennium. The sea walls were less formidable but still impressive, protecting the city along the Golden Horn to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south. In total, the city was protected by 14 miles of walls, a perimeter so vast that the emperor's small garrison could barely man them adequately. Previous Ottoman sultans had looked at these walls and decided they were impregnable. Murad II had besieged the city twice and given up both times. Bayezid the Thunderbolt had been on the verge of taking the city when the Mongol invasion of Anatolia had forced him to abandon the siege. The walls had never been breached by direct assault. Never. Mehmed looked at those walls and saw not an impossibility but a problem to be solved. He was not a mystical warrior king like his ancestor Bayezid. He was something new in the world of monarchs. He was a military engineer, a logistician, a planner who believed that any obstacle could be overcome with sufficient preparation, sufficient resources, and sufficient will. His first step was to secure his rear. In 1452, just a year after taking the throne, Mehmed began construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosporus, at its narrowest point. The location was brilliant in its audacity. The fortress, called Rumeli Hisari, the Fortress of Europe, was built directly across from Anadolu Hisari, a fortress his great-grandfather Bayezid had constructed on the Asian shore. Together, these two fortresses would control the straits, cutting Constantinople off from any aid from the Black Sea. The Byzantines protested. The emperor sent ambassadors to plead with Mehmed, pointing out that the land on which he was building belonged to Constantinople, that such a fortress violated all existing treaties, that it was an act of war. Mehmed received the ambassadors with courtesy and ignored every word they said. Construction continued. The fortress rose with astonishing speed. Mehmed personally supervised the construction, working alongside his engineers and laborers. He had inherited his father's ability to inspire loyalty in his men, but he added to it a work ethic that drove everyone around him to exhaustion. The Sultan was the first to arrive at the construction site each morning and the last to leave each night. He slept in a tent near the works. He ate the same food as his laborers. He drove them mercilessly, but he drove himself even harder. The design of Rumeli Hisari was ingenious. The fortress was shaped like an irregular polygon, following the contours of the steep hillside. 3 massive towers anchored the structure, each designed by one of Mehmed's top generals. The walls connecting the towers were thick enough to mount heavy cannon. The fortress had only one purpose: to close the straits to any ship that tried to pass without Ottoman permission. The Byzantines watched in growing despair as the fortress took shape. They knew what it meant. They knew that once Rumeli Hisari was complete, their city would be cut off from the Black Sea, from the grain ships that kept them fed, from any hope of reinforcement from the Christian kingdoms to the north. They sent more ambassadors. They pleaded, they cajoled, they threatened. Mehmed ignored them all. In just 4.5 months, the fortress was complete. It was a staggering achievement, a monument to Ottoman organizational ability and Mehmed's driving will. The moment the fortress was finished and garrisoned, Mehmed announced a new regulation. Any ship passing through the straits must stop at Rumeli Hisari and pay a toll. Any ship that refused would be sunk. To demonstrate that this was no idle threat, when a Venetian vessel tried to run past the fortress without stopping, the Ottoman cannon opened fire. The ship was hit, shattered, and sank. The survivors, those who managed to swim to shore, were hauled before Mehmed. The captain and his officers were beheaded. Their heads were sent to Constantinople as a message. The rest of the crew were impaled along the shores of the Bosporus, their bodies left to rot as a warning to any other ship captains who might think about defying the Sultan's orders. Constantinople was now under blockade. But Mehmed was not yet ready to begin his siege. He needed something more, something that would give him the edge against those legendary walls. He needed artillery on a scale the world had never seen. Artillery in the 15th century was still a relatively new technology. Cannon had been used in warfare for about 100 years, but they were small, unreliable, and not particularly effective against strong fortifications. The largest cannon of the time could fire a stone ball weighing perhaps 200 pounds. They were useful for battering down the walls of ordinary castles, but against something like the Theodosian walls, they were inadequate. Mehmed needed bigger guns, much bigger guns, and he found the man who could build them in the most unlikely of places. A Hungarian engineer named Urban appeared at the Ottoman court in late 1452. Urban was a gunfounder, a specialist in casting bronze cannon. He had previously offered his services to Emperor Constantine, proposing to build large cannon for the defense of Constantinople. But the emperor had no money to pay him, and the Byzantines lacked the raw materials and facilities to cast truly large guns. Urban, like many skilled craftsmen of his time, followed the money. And the money was with Mehmed. When Urban described what he could build, Mehmed's eyes lit with the fervor of a man who has just discovered the key to achieving his greatest ambition. Urban claimed he could cast a cannon large enough to throw a stone ball weighing over half a ton. Such a weapon, he said, could batter down any wall ever built. Mehmed asked him if he could destroy the walls of Constantinople. Urban replied that he could destroy the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed gave Urban everything he asked for: money, materials, workers, facilities. The Hungarian set up a foundry in Edirne and began his work. The casting of the great gun took 3 months. It required massive amounts of bronze, melted and poured into a carefully prepared mold. The entire process was supervised by Urban himself, who knew that failure would likely cost him his head. In January 1453, the gun was ready for testing. Mehmed and his court assembled to watch. The enormous cannon, called a basilica, was loaded with a limestone ball weighing over 1,300 pounds. The gun was aimed at a target across an open field. When Urban gave the signal, the gunpowder was lit. The explosion was like nothing anyone had ever heard. The sound, contemporaries wrote, could be heard for miles. The ground shook. Smoke and flames belched from the barrel. And the massive stone ball flew through the air, smashed into the earth over a mile away, and buried itself 6 feet deep in the ground. Mehmed was ecstatic. He ordered Urban to cast more guns, as many as he could. The Hungarian worked through the winter and into the spring, producing a battery of large cannon. The greatest of them all, the gun that would become known as the Basilica, required a team of 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. The barrel was 27 feet long. It could fire a ball weighing nearly 1,400 pounds. But size came with problems. These massive guns were slow to load, taking several hours between shots. They were prone to overheating, cracking, and sometimes exploding. They consumed enormous amounts of gunpowder. Moving them was a logistical nightmare. And they were so heavy that they had to be positioned very carefully, for once in place, they could not easily be moved again. But none of these drawbacks mattered to Mehmed. He had his wall breakers. He had the weapons that would accomplish what no army had managed in 1,000 years. While Urban was casting his guns, Mehmed was assembling his army. From every corner of the empire, troops began to march toward Edirne. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps of slave soldiers taken as boys from Christian families, trained from childhood in warfare and fanatically loyal to the Sultan, assembled in their barracks. These were the best infantry in the world, disciplined, fearless, armed with the latest weapons including hand cannons and matchlock arquebuses. Mehmed had about 12,000 Janissaries, and they would form the core of his assault force. The regular infantry, called the Azaps, were levied from the Anatolian peasantry. They were less well-trained and equipped than the Janissaries, but they were numerous and brave. Mehmed had somewhere between 50 and 70,000 of these troops. They would form the first waves of assault, wearing down the defenders, forcing them to expend their ammunition and energy before the elite Janissaries were committed. The Sipahi cavalry, the backbone of Ottoman military power, also assembled. These were feudal horsemen, granted land in exchange for military service. They provided their own equipment and fought as heavy cavalry, the shock troops that could exploit any breakthrough or pursue a broken enemy. Mehmed had perhaps 20,000 Sipahi. In addition to his regular forces, Mehmed had an enormous number of irregulars, volunteers, and auxiliaries. These Bashi bazouks were motivated by the promise of loot. Islamic law stated that the first soldier to enter a conquered city through a breach in the walls could claim the property of any house he entered. The prospect of unlimited plunder drew adventurers and fortune-seekers from across the Muslim world. Mehmed let it be known that if Constantinople fell, the city would be given over to his army for 3 days of unrestricted looting. This was standard practice in siege warfare, a horrific tradition that would motivate his troops to fight with maximum ferocity. The promise drew tens of thousands of additional men to his banners. In total, Mehmed assembled an army of somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 men. The exact number is debated by historians, as contemporary sources vary wildly, with some Byzantine accounts claiming the Ottoman army numbered 200,000 or more. The truth is probably somewhere around 100,000 combat troops, plus a vast number of laborers, engineers, camp followers, and support personnel. Against this host, Constantinople could muster perhaps 7,000 defenders. Emperor Constantine had about 5,000 Byzantine troops, a mixture of professional soldiers and armed citizens. The Italian merchant colonies, particularly the Genoese, contributed about 2,000 men. The Venetians, despite being at peace with Mehmed, sent a small contingent. A Spanish nobleman named Don Francisco de Toledo commanded a small company of Spanish soldiers. The most significant foreign commander was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese soldier of fortune who arrived in January 1453 with 700 professional soldiers and offered his services to the emperor. Giustiniani was everything Constantine needed. He was experienced, having fought in numerous sieges. He was brave. He was skilled in the latest techniques of defensive warfare. And most importantly, he was willing to stay and fight. Constantine made him commander of the land walls, the most critical defensive position. Giustiniani and his men would be stationed at the weakest point in the walls, the Mesotachion, the middle section where the land walls ran across the Lycus River valley. This area was problematic because the walls here were slightly lower and the ground outside was flatter, making it easier for attackers to bring up siege equipment and artillery. The defenders knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they had advantages. The walls were formidable. The city had ample food supplies to last months, perhaps even years if rationed carefully. And help might be coming. The emperor had sent desperate appeals to the Christian powers of Europe. Surely, the defenders told themselves, surely Christendom would not allow Constantinople to fall. Surely the Pope would call a crusade. Surely Venice and Genoa, with their vast fleets and commercial interests in the east, would send relief. Surely Hungary, which had its own reasons to fear Ottoman expansion, would march south with an army. These hopes would prove to be nothing but illusions, but in the early months of 1453, they sustained the defenders' morale. They told themselves they only needed to hold out long enough for help to arrive. They told themselves the walls had never been breached. They told themselves that God would not allow the greatest city in Christendom to fall to the infidel. Mehmed, marshalling his forces in Edirne, allowed them these illusions. Let them hope. Let them believe in miracles and divine intervention. He knew better. He knew that no help was coming. He knew that Europe was divided, that the Catholic and Orthodox churches were at odds, that Venice and Genoa were more interested in protecting their trade privileges than in saving Constantinople. He knew that Hungary was exhausted from decades of warfare with the Ottomans. He knew that the Pope might call for a crusade, but that such an effort would take months or years to organize, and Constantinople did not have months or years. In March 1453, Mehmed gave the order to march. The immense army began to move from Edirne toward Constantinople, a distance of about 140 miles. It was a logistical nightmare on a scale that challenges modern imagination. 100,000 soldiers, tens of thousands of pack animals, hundreds of wagons carrying supplies, siege equipment, ammunition, food, and the massive cannon. The roads from Edirne to Constantinople were in poor condition, little more than dirt tracks in many places. Moving the Great Basilica cannon required building new roads in some sections, filling in gullies, reinforcing bridges. Teams of engineers went ahead of the main army, preparing the way. The gun was so massive and moved so slowly that it took 2 months to cover the 140 miles from Edirne to Constantinople. Urban and his crews nursed it along, terrified that it might crack or overturn. 60 oxen pulled it during the day. At night, 200 men took over, hauling on ropes to move the monster forward inch by inch. Mehmed rode alongside the gun for much of the journey, personally supervising its transport. This was his prize, his wallbreaker, and he would ensure that it reached its destination intact. The people of Constantinople watched the Ottoman army approach with a mixture of dread and defiance. From the walls, they could see the endless columns of troops, the clouds of dust raised by thousands of marching feet, the glint of sunlight on spear points and armor. They could see the siege train, the cannon being hauled into position, the thousands of laborers beginning to dig trenches and build fortifications. The Ottomans set up their camp just beyond the range of the Byzantine artillery, a vast city of tents that seemed to stretch forever. Mehmed established his headquarters directly opposite the Mesotekion section of the walls, the area he had identified as the weakest point. His imperial tent, red and gold, was raised on a small hill where he could observe the entire siege. From this vantage point, he could see the walls, could watch his troops, could direct operations. And from the walls, the defenders could see him, a visible reminder of the will driving the assault against them. On April 5, 1453, the Ottoman army completed its encirclement of Constantinople. The city was now cut off by land and by sea. Mehmed had assembled a fleet of over 300 ships, a mixture of galleys, transport vessels, and smaller craft. These ships blockaded the sea walls along the Marmara coast and prepared to attack the chain that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn was a deep natural harbor on the north side of Constantinople, about 4 miles long. It was protected by a massive chain stretched across its mouth, from the walls of Constantinople to the Genoese colony of Galata on the opposite shore. This chain, made of massive iron links, each as thick as a man's arm, was supported by wooden floats. It had been in place for centuries and had never been breached. Behind it, the small Byzantine fleet, about 10 ships in total, could shelter in safety. As long as the chain held, the sea walls along the Golden Horn were safe from attack, which meant the defenders could concentrate their limited forces on the land walls and the Marmara sea walls. Mehmed's admiral, Suleiman Baltolu, a Bulgarian convert to Islam and an experienced naval commander, tested the chain with a series of attacks. Ottoman galleys rowed at full speed toward the chain, trying to break it by sheer force. They failed. The chain held. Soldiers on the walls of Galata and Constantinople watched the attacks and cheered when the Ottoman ships were forced to retreat. The Byzantine sailors, commanded by a Venetian named Alviso Diedo, made several sorties from behind the chain, using Greek fire, the legendary Byzantine incendiary weapon, to set Ottoman ships ablaze. Greek fire was a closely guarded Byzantine secret, a chemical mixture that ignited on contact with water and burned with such intensity that it could not be extinguished by normal means. The formula had been lost by 1453, but some of the defenders still had access to stores of the substance. When they launched it from siphons mounted on the prows of their ships, it was terrifyingly effective. Ottoman sailors, their clothes and skin burning with unquenchable fire, threw themselves into the sea, only to find that the flames followed them into the water. The screams of burning men echoed across the harbor. Baltgalu's fleet pulled back, unable to force the chain. But the real assault would come against the land walls. On April 6, Mehmed ordered his cannon to open fire. Urban's great basilica was positioned about a quarter-mile from the walls, directly opposite the Mesotekion section. The smaller cannon were distributed along the Ottoman lines, each one aimed at a section of wall. Mehmed's plan was simple in concept but difficult in execution. The cannon would batter the walls day after day, weakening them, creating breaches. Then his infantry would assault through those breaches. Weight of numbers and sustained bombardment would accomplish what no previous attacker had managed. The first shot from the Great Basilica was an event that awed even Mehmed's own troops. When the gun fired, the noise was apocalyptic. Inside Constantinople, people a mile away from the impact thought the world was ending. The massive stone ball struck the Theodosian walls with tremendous force. Stone chips and dust exploded from the point of impact. A section of the outer wall cracked and partially collapsed. Inside the city, the defenders watched in horror. They had never seen anything like this. Previous sieges had involved small cannon that did little more than chip away at the stonework. This was something entirely different. This was a weapon that could knock down city walls in a matter of days. Panic began to spread through the population. Some wealthy families began loading their valuables onto ships, preparing to flee. Emperor Constantine moved through the city, showing himself to the people, trying to rally their spirits. He reminded them of their history, of the many times Constantinople had been besieged and had always prevailed. He reminded them that they were the heirs of Rome, the defenders of Christendom. His presence helped calm the panic, but everyone could hear the thunder of the Ottoman guns, could feel the ground shake with each impact. The Byzantine defenders were not passive. Giovanni Giustiniani organized work parties to repair the damage each night. It became a race. During the day, the Ottoman cannon would batter the walls, creating breaches and weakening the structure. During the night, the defenders would work frantically to repair the damage, piling rubble behind the breaches, building wooden palisades, anything to restore the defensive line before the next day's bombardment began. The citizens of Constantinople, soldiers and civilians alike, worked through the nights. Women and children carried baskets of stone and earth. Monks abandoned their monasteries to labor on the walls. Aristocrats worked alongside beggars. The entire population was united in the desperate effort to keep the walls intact. They worked by torchlight, visible to the Ottoman besiegers, who sometimes fired arrows into the work parties, killing workers and sending the rest scrambling for cover. But as soon as the arrow storm passed, the workers would return, driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on keeping those walls standing. Mehmed watched these nocturnal repairs with a mixture of admiration and frustration. The defenders were showing incredible resilience. But he had patience and resources they could not match. Let them work through the night. Let them exhaust themselves. He had 100,000 men who could take turns resting while a small percentage maintained the siege. The defenders had no such luxury. Every able-bodied person in Constantinople was needed on the walls, and they could not rest, could not pause, could not stop working because to stop meant death. The bombardment continued day after day. The Great Basilica fired about 7 times per day, as quickly as Urban and his crew could load and cool the massive gun. Each shot required about 3 hours of preparation. The gun had to be allowed to cool after each firing, or the metal might crack. The barrel had to be cleaned. The massive stone ball had to be carefully positioned. The gunpowder charge had to be measured and loaded. Then the gun had to be aimed, a difficult process given its weight and size. Only then could it be fired. The smaller cannon fired more frequently, maintaining a nearly constant bombardment. The sound became the background noise of the siege, a thunder that never ended, that invaded dreams, that drove some people mad. Children born during the siege would never know silence. The elderly remembered quieter times and wept. The walls held, but barely. The outer wall was breached in several places. The defenders abandoned it in some sections, falling back to the inner wall, which was much more formidable. But the inner wall too began to show damage. Cracks appeared in the masonry. Towers that had stood for 1,000 years began to lean. And everyone knew that eventually, inevitably, a breach would be opened that could not be repaired in time. Mehmed tried repeated assaults. He would send waves of irregulars, the Bashi bazooks, charging at the walls, probing for weaknesses, trying to overwhelm the defenders by sheer numbers. These assaults were suicidal. The defenders had the advantage of height and position. They poured arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, and boiling oil onto the attackers. The irregulars, poorly armored and lightly armed, were slaughtered by the hundreds. They would charge up to the walls, try to scale them with ladders, and be driven back with horrific casualties. But Mehmed did not care about the casualties among the irregulars. They were expendable. Their purpose was to tire the defenders, to force them to expend ammunition, to wear them down physically and mentally. After each failed assault, the Ottomans would fall back, regroup, and attack again. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 assaults in a single day. The defenders had no time to rest, no time to recover. They had to be constantly vigilant, constantly ready to repel the next attack. Giovanni Giustiniani proved to be worth his weight in gold. He was everywhere, directing the defense, encouraging the men, personally fighting at the most critical points. When a section of wall looked like it might be overrun, Giustiniani would lead a counterattack, driving the Ottomans back. His presence inspired the defenders, gave them hope. If this renowned soldier believed they could hold, then perhaps they could. But as the days turned into weeks, the strain began to tell. The defenders were exhausted, running on adrenaline and desperation. Food was still adequate, but sleep was almost impossible. The constant bombardment, the periodic assaults, the nocturnal repair work, all combined to create a nightmare of perpetual crisis. Men began to crack under the strain. Some deserted, fleeing to the Ottoman lines and converting to Islam to save their lives. Others became fatalistic, certain that death was inevitable, fighting on out of stubbornness rather than hope. Emperor Constantine was a tower of strength. He was in his late 40s, a veteran of numerous battles, a man who understood that his fate and the fate of his city were inseparable. If Constantinople fell, he would die. There was no question of surrender or escape. The last Roman emperor would stand on the walls of the last Roman city and fight until the end. This certainty gave him a kind of terrible nobility. He moved through the city like a ghost, his face drawn with exhaustion but his resolve unshaken. When people saw him, they found the strength to continue. If the emperor could endure, so could they. Constantine tried one last diplomatic effort. He sent envoys to Mehmed, offering to pay tribute, to become a vassal, to surrender all Byzantine territory outside Constantinople itself, if only the Sultan would lift the siege. The envoys found Mehmed in his tent, surrounded by his generals. The young Sultan listened to the offer without expression. When the envoys finished, Mehmed responded with the cold finality that characterized all his dealings. He told them that Constantinople had defied Ottoman power for too long. He told them that the city was rightfully his, that the Prophet had promised it to Islam, that he would have it or die in the attempt. He offered Constantine one alternative to total surrender. The emperor could leave the city with his family and retainers. He would be given lands in the Peloponnese and allowed to live out his life in peace. The city would be spared sack and pillage. The inhabitants would be allowed to leave safely or stay as Ottoman subjects. Constantine rejected the offer without hesitation. He told the envoys to inform Mehmed that he would never surrender the city. If Mehmed wanted Constantinople, he would have to take it by force, and he would find that the Romans still knew how to die bravely. The envoys returned to the Ottoman camp and delivered Constantine's defiant response. Mehmed received the message without surprise. He had expected nothing less. The siege would continue, but Mehmed was growing frustrated. It was now late April, and the siege had been underway for nearly a month. The walls were damaged but not breached sufficiently for a successful assault. The defenders were exhausted but still fighting with grim determination. And Mehmed knew that time was not entirely on his side. Spring was advancing. Soon the seas would be calm enough for major fleets to sail from Italy. If Venice and Genoa decided to send relief, they might arrive with enough force to break his blockade. If Hungary decided to attack from the north, he would be caught between two enemies. Mehmed decided he needed to escalate. He needed to find a way to attack the walls from a new direction, to force the defenders to divide their already thin forces. And he fixed on the one section of Constantinople's defenses that was weakly held. The walls along the Golden Horn. If he could somehow get ships into the Golden Horn, behind the Great Chain, he could attack those walls and force Constantine to pull troops from the land walls to defend against this new threat. But how to get ships into the Golden Horn? The chain blocked the entrance. It had proven impregnable to direct assault. Attacking the Genoese colony of Galata, which controlled one end of the chain, was diplomatically impossible. The Genoese had declared neutrality. They allowed Mehmed's army to use their territory but were not actively supporting either side. If Mehmed attacked Galata, he would turn the Genoese across the Mediterranean against him, threatening his diplomatic and commercial interests. The solution, when it came to Mehmed, was so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that when he proposed it to his generals, some of them thought he had gone mad. He would not break the chain. He would not attack Galata. Instead, he would bypass the chain entirely by transporting his ships overland, around Galata, and launching them into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The plan seemed insane. The terrain between the Bosporus, where his fleet was anchored, and the Golden Horn involved a steep hill, about 200 feet high. How could ships, even relatively small galleys, be moved over such terrain? But Mehmed was already working out the details. He had thousands of laborers. He had oxen. He had timber. His engineers could build a road, a slipway of greased wooden beams. The ships could be placed on large wooden cradles, which could be dragged over the slipway by teams of oxen and men. Mehmed ordered his engineers to begin work immediately. Thousands of workers cut trees and shaped them into beams. The beams were laid side by side, creating a wooden road about 3 miles long, running from the Bosporus Valley, up over the hill behind Galata, and down to the shores of the Golden Horn. The beams were coated with grease and animal fat to reduce friction. Wooden cradles were constructed, sized to hold galleys. The defenders of Constantinople, watching from their walls, could see unusual activity in the Ottoman camp behind Galata but could not discern what was being planned. They assumed Mehmed was building fortifications or perhaps preparing a major assault on that sector of the walls. They did not imagine, could not have imagined, what was actually being prepared. On the night of April 22, Mehmed ordered the operation to begin. About 70 Ottoman ships, mostly small galleys and transport vessels, were hauled out of the water and placed on the wooden cradles. Teams of oxen, dozens of them per ship, were harnessed to the cradles. Thousands of men took up ropes. At Mehmed's signal, they began to pull. Slowly, incredibly, impossibly, the ships began to move. They slid across the greased beams, up the hill, the oxen straining, the men chanting to keep time as they hauled on the ropes. Mehmed had drums and fifes playing martial music to keep the men motivated and to drown out the creaking and groaning of the wooden cradles. The ships had their sails raised, not for propulsion but for show, creating the surreal image of sailing ships moving across dry land, up a hill, under their own sails. The operation took all night. Ship after ship was hauled up the hill and down the other side. By dawn on April 23, 70 Ottoman vessels were floating in the Golden Horn, behind the Great Chain, threatening the previously safe northern walls of Constantinople. The defenders could not believe what they were seeing. When the first light of dawn revealed the Ottoman fleet inside the Golden Horn, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then panic erupted. How was this possible? How had Mehmed achieved this miracle? Some thought it was witchcraft, that the Sultan had made a pact with demons. Others thought God had abandoned them, that divine providence had turned against Constantinople. The more rational understood that this was simply brilliant military engineering, but that knowledge did not lessen the catastrophe. Constantine was forced to pull troops from the land walls to defend the sea walls along the Golden Horn. The walls here were lower and weaker than the Theodosian walls. They had not been designed to withstand a major assault because they had never needed to. The Golden Horn was supposed to be safe. Now, suddenly, it was not. Giustiniani had to divide his forces, sending some of his best men to the Golden Horn walls. The defense of the land walls became even more precarious. The Byzantines were not entirely helpless. They still had their small fleet, trapped behind the chain but still operational. They decided to launch a night attack against the Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn, hoping to destroy them while they were crowded together and vulnerable. On the night of April 28, the Byzantine fleet, reinforced by ships from the Italian colonies, attempted to attack. It was a disaster. The plan had been leaked, possibly by a Genoese merchant in Galata who was hedging his bets by secretly supporting Mehmed. The Ottomans were ready. When the Byzantine ships approached, they were met with a storm of arrows and cannon fire. The Ottoman fleet, though less skilled in naval warfare than the Byzantines, had the advantages of numbers and position. The attack was repulsed with heavy losses. Several Byzantine ships were captured. Others limped back to their moorings, damaged and demoralized. Mehmed used the captured Byzantine sailors to send another message. He had them impaled on the shores of the Golden Horn, within view of the city walls. The sight of their own people dying in agony, screaming for help that would never come, broke the morale of many defenders. Some began to talk of surrender. Others spoke of fleeing the city before it was too late. Constantine had to move through the city again, threatening punishment for defeatism, promising that relief was coming, that they would be saved if they could just hold on a little longer. But everyone knew the truth. No relief was coming. The Pope had called for a crusade, but it would take months to organize. Venice and Genoa were still debating what to do, unwilling to risk their valuable fleets and soldiers for a city that might already be doomed. Hungary was dealing with its own problems and could not march south. Constantinople was alone, cut off, slowly being strangled by Mehmed's siege. By early May, the situation was critical. The walls were badly damaged. The defenders were at the limits of their endurance. Food supplies, while still adequate, were beginning to run low. Ammunition was running out. Arrows, crossbow bolts, gunpowder, all were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. The defenders began to ration their ammunition, told to shoot only when they had clear targets, to conserve every arrow. Meanwhile, the Ottoman bombardment continued relentlessly. Mehmed could sense victory approaching, but he also knew he needed to finish this quickly. It was now May, and the campaigning season was well advanced. If Constantinople did not fall soon, he might have to lift the siege and try again the following year. The thought was unbearable. He had committed everything to this siege. His prestige, his resources, his reputation. If he failed, if he had to retreat with the city still defiant, he would be seen as weak. Rivals within the empire might challenge his authority. He could not allow that. He would take Constantinople or die trying. He decided to make one final, massive assault. He would throw everything at the walls simultaneously. His cannon would bombard the walls day and night for several days, weakening them as much as possible. Then he would launch coordinated attacks on multiple points along the walls, forcing the defenders to divide their forces. The irregulars would attack first, wearing down the defenders. Then the regular troops would attack. And finally, the Janissaries, his elite troops, would be committed to exploit any breakthrough. Mehmed announced his plan to his assembled army. He reminded them of the rewards that awaited. The first soldier to breach the walls would be richly rewarded, perhaps even made a governor. The city would be theirs to plunder for 3 days. Everything in Constantinople, its wealth, its treasures, its people, would belong to the army. He invoked the prophecy of the prophet, that Constantinople would fall to Islam and that the commander who took it would be blessed. He told his soldiers that they were about to achieve what no Ottoman Sultan had achieved, what no Muslim army had managed for 800 years. They were about to conquer the Queen of Cities. The army responded with fanatical enthusiasm. Men who had been enduring the hardships of siege warfare for nearly 2 months, living in muddy camps, dying by the hundreds in failed assaults, suddenly found new energy. The promise of loot and glory motivated them as nothing else could. They sharpened their weapons, said their prayers, and prepared for the final assault. Inside Constantinople, the defenders could sense that the end was approaching. The Ottoman bombardment intensified to a level that defied belief. The cannon fired day and night without pause. Mehmed had ordered continuous bombardment, accepting that some of his guns would overheat and crack. Several of the smaller cannon did exactly that, exploding and killing their crews. But Mehmed did not care. He had more guns, more ammunition, more men. He could afford losses. The defenders could not. The Theodosian walls were now in ruins in several places. The outer wall had been almost completely destroyed along a 300-yard stretch near the Mesotekion. The inner wall was heavily damaged, with several large breaches. The defenders had piled rubble, timber, and earth behind these breaches, creating makeshift barriers, but everyone knew these would not hold against a determined assault. On May 28, Mehmed called a council of war with his top commanders. He announced that the final assault would take place the next day, May 29. He went over the plan in detail. The fleet would attack the sea walls simultaneously with the land assault, preventing the defenders from concentrating their forces. The irregulars would attack first, at dawn. They would be followed by the Anatolian provincial troops. Finally, the Janissaries would attack. Mehmed himself would be present, commanding from his post opposite the Mesotekion, ready to commit reserves where they were needed. One of his generals, Zaganos Pasha, suggested that perhaps they should try one more time to negotiate a surrender. Surely, after 2 months of siege, the defenders would be willing to talk. Mehmed refused. He had offered terms and they had been rejected. Constantinople had chosen defiance. Now the city would pay the price. There would be no more negotiations, no more delays. Tomorrow, the city would fall or his army would die trying. That night, both sides prepared in their own ways. In the Ottoman camp, the soldiers rested, prayed, and prepared their equipment. Mehmed ordered bonfires lit all around the city, thousands of them, so that Constantinople was surrounded by a ring of fire. The psychological effect was devastating. From the walls, the defenders could see the countless fires, could hear the sounds of the vast army preparing for battle, could sense the implacable will driving toward them. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine held a final council. He spoke to his commanders, to the representatives of the various communities, to the clergy. He thanked them for their loyalty and courage. He told them that the end was near but that they would die as Romans, as Christians, as free men. He asked forgiveness from anyone he might have wronged. He released his soldiers and subjects from their oaths of loyalty, telling them that anyone who wished to flee could do so without dishonor. No one left. They would stand with their emperor to the end. Constantine then led a procession through the city to the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. The church was packed with people, soldiers and civilians, Orthodox and Catholic, Greeks and Italians, all united in the face of death. The ancient liturgy was sung for what everyone knew might be the last time. Constantine took communion, made his confession, and prayed for the strength to face what was coming. When the service ended, he embraced the Italian commanders, thanked them for their loyalty, and rode through the night to take his position on the walls. The night was agonizingly long. The defenders stood at their posts, watching the fires in the Ottoman camp, listening to the sounds of preparation. Some men prayed. Others wrote letters to loved ones they would never see again. Some simply stood in silence, too exhausted for anything else. Giovanni Giustiniani walked the walls, checking the defenses one last time, speaking words of encouragement to the men. At about 1:30 in the morning of May 29, the Ottoman cannon fell silent. After nearly 2 months of constant bombardment, the sudden quiet was eerie, almost frightening. The defenders knew what it meant. The time for artillery preparation was over. Now came the assault. Mehmed had given his troops a few hours to rest before the attack. At about 1 in the morning, the army began to form up. The irregulars, the Bashi bazooks, were assembled in their thousands. They were poorly armed, many with nothing more than clubs and knives, but they were numerous and desperate. These were the men who would die first, who would climb over their own dead to reach the walls, who would be slaughtered by the hundreds but whose sheer numbers might overwhelm the defenders. Behind them, the regular provincial troops, better armed and armored, waited for their turn. And behind them, the Janissaries, in their distinctive white caps, stood in perfect formation, silent and disciplined. These were the elite, and they would not be committed until the irregulars and regulars had done their work. Mehmed mounted his horse and rode along the lines, visible to his troops in the light of the thousands of bonfires. He gave a final speech, reminding them of their duty, of the rewards awaiting them, of the glory that would be theirs. Then he took his position on his hill, surrounded by his bodyguards, where he could observe the entire battle and direct reinforcements as needed. At dawn, just as the first light began to appear in the east, Mehmed gave the signal. Drums began to beat, a rhythm that would continue without pause for hours. Trumpets blared, cymbals crashed. The entire Ottoman army raised a war cry that could be heard for miles. And then the irregulars charged. They came in a human wave, tens of thousands of men running at the walls, screaming, waving their weapons. The defenders watched them come with grim determination. The Italians and Greeks had been standing at their posts all night. They were exhausted, but they were ready. As the irregulars came within range, the defenders opened fire. Arrows, crossbow bolts, and bullets from arquebuses slashed into the charging mass. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. But those behind simply ran over the bodies and kept coming. They reached the ruined outer wall and swarmed over it. They reached the fosse, the ditch in front of the inner wall, and tried to cross it. The defenders dropped stones and timbers on them, poured boiling oil, fired down into the packed mass of humanity struggling in the ditch. The irregulars tried to raise ladders against the inner wall. Most of the ladders were too short or broke under the weight of the men climbing them. Those that held were pushed away from the walls or had their climbers shot or stabbed as they tried to reach the top. But still they came, driven by the promise of loot, by religious fervor, by the simple fact that retreating meant facing Mehmed's wrath. For 2 hours, the irregulars assaulted the walls. For 2 hours, they died in their thousands. The fosse filled with bodies. The ground before the walls became slick with blood. The defenders, fighting for their lives, showed no mercy. They killed until their arms were numb from fatigue, until their hands were blistered from gripping weapons, until they were standing ankle-deep in spent arrows and crossbow bolts. Finally, the irregulars broke. They had had enough. They began to retreat, first in ones and twos, then in larger groups, finally in a complete rout. They ran back toward their own lines, pursued by jeers and arrows from the walls. Mehmed had anticipated this. He had cavalry positioned behind the irregulars with orders to prevent them from retreating. The fleeing irregulars were driven back toward the walls at sword point. Some were cut down by their own side. Others turned and charged the walls again, preferring to die fighting the Byzantines than be executed by their own commanders. But eventually, even the threat of execution could not keep them in the fight. The irregulars had been destroyed as a fighting force. Perhaps 10,000 of them lay dead or dying before the walls. The survivors staggered back to the Ottoman lines, broken and demoralized. The defenders on the walls allowed themselves a moment of hope. They had held. The Ottoman assault had been repulsed. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could survive this. But then they saw the second wave forming up. The Anatolian provincial troops, 50,000 strong, were preparing to attack. And these were real soldiers, well-armed, well-trained, and led by experienced officers. The second assault began around sunrise, perhaps 6 in the morning. Fresh troops attacked the battered, exhausted defenders. The Anatolian soldiers were more disciplined than the irregulars. They did not simply charge the walls in a mob. They advanced in organized units, with supporting fire from archers and artillery. They brought up better ladders, proper siege towers, more sophisticated equipment. The fighting intensified. The defenders, many of whom had been standing and fighting for 6 hours now, were reaching the limits of human endurance. But they could not rest, could not pause. If the walls fell, everyone would die or be enslaved. There was no choice but to fight on. Giovanni Giustiniani was magnificent. He was everywhere along the Mesotekion section, the main point of attack, directing the defense, leading counterattacks, personally fighting with sword and spear. His example inspired the defenders to superhuman efforts. When a section of the makeshift barrier behind one of the breaches was overrun, Giustiniani led a charge that drove the Ottomans back and retook the position. He was wounded multiple times, but he refused to leave the walls. Emperor Constantine fought alongside him. The last Roman emperor, wearing his imperial armor but with no insignia to mark his rank, fought as a common soldier. He stood in the front line, killed his share of enemies, and showed by his example that if the emperor could fight and die on the walls, so could everyone else. For hours, the battle raged. The Anatolian troops kept coming, wave after wave, climbing over their own dead to reach the walls. Sections of the wall changed hands multiple times. The defenders would drive the Ottomans back from a breach, only to have another wave attack immediately, forcing them to fight for the same ground again. It was exhausting, nightmarish, a kind of hell where the fighting never stopped and the waves of enemies never ended. But the Anatolian assault, like the irregular assault before it, eventually lost momentum. The troops were tired, their casualties had been enormous, and they had not achieved a breakthrough. The walls still stood. The defenders, battered and bloodied but unbroken, still held their positions. The Anatolian troops began to fall back, their attack turning into a retreat. From his vantage point, Mehmed watched with a sinking feeling in his stomach. 2 major assaults had been repulsed. His casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands of his soldiers lay dead before the walls. And the defenders, though surely near collapse, were still fighting. Perhaps, a small voice whispered in his mind, perhaps the city truly was impregnable. Perhaps God, or Allah, or fate, or whatever force governed such things, had decreed that Constantinople would never fall. But Mehmed silenced that voice. He had not come this far, sacrificed this much, to turn back now. He had one more card to play. The Janissaries, his elite troops, 12,000 of the best soldiers in the world, fresh and ready to fight. If they could not break through, nothing could. Mehmed gave the order. The drums beat a new rhythm. The Janissaries advanced. They moved in perfect formation, their ranks straight, their discipline absolute. These were not wild irregulars or provincial militia. These were professional soldiers, trained from childhood in the art of war, fanatically loyal to the Sultan, armed with the latest weapons including numerous handguns and arquebuses. The defenders watched them come and knew that this was the crisis. If they could turn back the Janissaries, they would survive. If the Janissaries broke through, all was lost. Every man still able to fight took his position. The wounded, those who could still hold a weapon, crawled back to their posts. Even civilians armed themselves and stood ready to fight. The Janissaries attacked with methodical fury. They did not scream or shout. They advanced in silence, an eerie contrast to the earlier assaults. They brought up their ladders, and men began to climb. The defenders shot them down, but more climbed. The Janissaries reached the top of the walls in several places, and vicious hand-to-hand fighting erupted. The defenders were exhausted, but they fought with the desperation of men who knew they were fighting for their lives, their families, their world. Italians and Greeks fought side by side, nobles and commoners, Orthodox and Catholic, all united in the face of annihilation. The fighting on the walls became apocalyptic in its violence. Men hacked at each other with swords and axes, grappled and fell from the walls locked in death grips, fought with knives and bare hands when their weapons broke. And then disaster struck the defenders. Giovanni Giustiniani, the heart and soul of the defense, the man whose courage and leadership had held the walls for 2 months, was struck by a bullet. The projectile, fired from an Ottoman hand cannon, smashed through his breastplate and into his chest. Giustiniani, blood pouring from his wound, staggered back from the wall. His men gathered around him, desperate to save their commander. Giustiniani, in terrible pain, unable to breathe properly, knew he was dying. He asked to be taken off the walls, to be carried to a ship so he could die in peace rather than in the chaos of battle. His men carried him back from the walls, through one of the gates, toward the harbor. The sight of the great Genoese commander being carried away, clearly mortally wounded, had a devastating effect on morale. Soldiers saw him go and thought, if Giustiniani is leaving, if even he cannot hold, then all is lost. Some men began to abandon their posts, following Giustiniani toward the harbor, hoping to escape on the Italian ships before it was too late. Emperor Constantine saw what was happening and tried to stop the rout. He rode to the gate through which Giustiniani had been carried and ordered it shut, trying to prevent more men from fleeing. But the damage was done. A critical moment had passed. The defense had lost its cohesion. And the Janissaries, sensing weakness, redoubled their assault. At the same time, a small group of about 50 Ottoman soldiers found an obscure gate in the walls, the Kirkoporta, which had been left unlocked by mistake. This small postern gate, used by the defenders to make sorties, had been opened earlier in the night and in the chaos had not been properly secured. The Ottoman troops forced it open and poured through. They were inside the walls. They raised their banners from one of the towers, and other Ottoman soldiers, seeing their flag flying from the walls, surged forward with renewed energy. The Janissaries, attacking at the main breaches, finally broke through. The defenders, exhausted, demoralized by the loss of Giustiniani, and now threatened from behind by the troops who had entered through the Kirkoporta, began to break. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Others fought on hopelessly, knowing they would die but determined to take as many enemies with them as possible. Emperor Constantine saw that the end had come. The walls were lost. The city was lost. His empire, the last remnant of Rome, was breathing its last breath. He could have tried to escape. Ships were still at the harbor. He could have fled to the Peloponnese, lived out his life as an exile. But Constantine XI Palaiologos was the heir of Augustus and Constantine the Great. He was a Roman, and Romans did not run. Constantine tore off his imperial regalia, the purple cloak and insignia that marked him as emperor. He wanted to die as a soldier, not to be recognized and captured. He turned to the few men still around him, his last loyal companions, and said words that would echo through history. The exact words are debated, but according to tradition he said something like, "The city is fallen and I am still alive." Then he drew his sword and charged into the mass of Ottoman troops pouring through the breached walls. Constantine XI, last emperor of Rome, last of the Caesars, died fighting in the streets of his capital. His body was never definitively identified. He disappeared into the chaos of the city's fall, one more corpse among thousands, indistinguishable in death from the common soldiers who died beside him. The empire that had begun with Augustus in 27 BC ended with Constantine on May 29, 1453, not with a grand ceremony or a formal surrender, but with an emperor dying sword in hand in the streets of his burning city. The fall of the walls opened the floodgates. Ottoman troops poured into Constantinople from multiple points. The promised 3 days of sack began immediately. What followed was one of the great atrocities of medieval history, though sadly not an unusual one for the time. This was standard practice in siege warfare. A city that resisted was given no mercy. The Ottoman soldiers, many of whom had been fighting for 2 months, living in muddy camps, watching their comrades die by the thousands, were unleashed on the city with Mehmed's blessing. They saw 3 things: loot, slaves, and revenge. They got all 3. The killing was indiscriminate at first. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, children, the old, the young, it made no difference. The Ottomans cut down everyone they encountered in the first hours of the sack. The streets ran with blood. Bodies piled up in the squares. Churches were invaded, their treasures looted. The people who had sought sanctuary there killed or dragged out to be sold as slaves. The Italian and Greek defenders who had not managed to escape to ships were hunted down and killed. Some made last stands in particular buildings or towers, fighting until they were overwhelmed. Others tried to hide, but were found and slaughtered. The Genoese and Venetian merchants, who had thought their neutrality or their citizenship might protect them, found that in the chaos of the sack, such distinctions meant nothing. They were killed or enslaved alongside the Greeks. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which had been the center of Orthodox Christianity for 900 years, was desecrated. The soldiers smashed the iconostasis, the screen covered with holy icons. They tore down the silk hangings. They looted the altar of its gold and silver vessels. The priests who tried to defend the church were killed. The people who had gathered there for a final prayer were dragged out to be enslaved. According to legend, some priests conducting the divine liturgy were killed at the altar, and the liturgy remains uncompleted to this day, waiting for the city's reconquest that will never come. But as the initial bloodlust faded, the sack became more organized. The soldiers realized that live captives were more valuable than dead bodies. Slaves could be sold. A healthy young woman might bring 100 gold coins. A skilled craftsman was worth even more. Children were valuable because they could be trained. Even the elderly had some value for ransom. The indiscriminate killing slowed, replaced by systematic enslavement. Soldiers went house to house, rounding up the inhabitants. Families were separated. Wives were torn from husbands, children from parents. The captives were herded into pens like cattle, to be sorted and sold later. The weeping and wailing of the enslaved echoed through the city, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Mehmed himself entered the city late in the afternoon of May 29. He rode through the streets, taking in the destruction, the piles of bodies, the smoke from burning buildings. His face, witnesses said, showed no expression. This was what victory looked like. This was the price of Constantinople's defiance. He rode to Hagia Sophia and entered the great cathedral. He found a soldier smashing the marble floor with an axe, trying to pry up pieces to take as loot. Mehmed struck the man with his sword, chastising him. He had given the army 3 days to plunder, but he wanted the buildings preserved. They were his now, part of his conquest, and he would not have them destroyed. Mehmed ordered one of his religious scholars to climb to the cathedral's pulpit and recite the Islamic call to prayer. The sound echoed through the vast space, now empty of its Christian congregation. Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built by the Emperor Justinian 1,000 years earlier, was now a mosque. Mehmed performed his prayers there, symbolically claiming the building and the city for Islam. Over the next 3 days, the sack continued. The wealth of Constantinople, accumulated over a millennium, was looted. Gold and silver plate from churches and palaces, jewels and precious artifacts, books and manuscripts, many of which were destroyed or lost. Works of art. The treasures were carried off to the Ottoman camp to be distributed among the soldiers or claimed by Mehmed for the imperial treasury. The exact value of what was taken will never be known, but it was immense. After 3 days, Mehmed ordered the sack to end. His soldiers had had their reward. Now it was time to restore order. The killing stopped. The remaining population, those who had survived and had not been enslaved, were gathered and counted. Mehmed needed people to rebuild the city. He could not rule over ruins and emptiness. He declared that those who had survived the sack could remain as Ottoman subjects with certain protections. He brought in Muslim colonists from Anatolia to repopulate the city. He invited Greeks who had fled to return, promising them safety and the right to practice their religion. The city's name was changed. Constantinople became Istanbul, though the name would not become official for many years. The transformation from Christian capital to Muslim capital began immediately. Churches were converted to mosques. The crosses atop the buildings were replaced with crescents. The city that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years was now the capital of an Islamic empire. Mehmed set about rebuilding. The population of Constantinople had fallen from perhaps 100,000 before the siege to perhaps 50,000 or fewer after the sack and mass enslavement. The city was a shell of its former self. Entire neighborhoods were empty, buildings were damaged or destroyed, infrastructure had collapsed. But Mehmed had vision. He saw not what Constantinople was, but what it could become under his rule. He repaired the walls, the same walls he had battered for 2 months. He rebuilt the harbors. He constructed new mosques, including the Great Fatih Mosque, built on the site of the Church of the Holy Apostles. He brought in craftsmen, merchants, and scholars from across his empire and beyond. He wanted Istanbul to be not just a military capital but a cultural and commercial center, a worthy successor to Byzantine Constantinople. The conquest of Constantinople was Mehmed's greatest achievement, but it was not his last. He spent the remaining 30 years of his reign expanding the Ottoman Empire in every direction. He understood that taking Constantinople was only the first step. To secure his conquest, he needed to eliminate any possibility of a Byzantine restoration. In 1460, Mehmed invaded the Morea, the Byzantine despotate in the Peloponnese ruled by Constantine's brothers. The campaign was swift and brutal. The Byzantine fortifications, impressive but not comparable to Constantinople's walls, fell one after another. The last Byzantine princes were forced to flee. Thomas Palaiologos escaped to Italy, carrying with him what he claimed was the head of St. Andrew, which he presented to the Pope. Demetrios Palaiologos surrendered and spent the rest of his life in comfortable captivity. The last vestiges of Byzantine political power were extinguished. Mehmed then turned his attention to the Balkans. Serbia, which had maintained a precarious independence, was invaded and conquered by 1459. The Serbian despot, faced with overwhelming force, surrendered. Serbia became an Ottoman province, its people subject to Ottoman law and taxation. The famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where the Serbs had fought the Ottomans to a standstill, was now a distant memory. The Ottomans had won. Bosnia fell next. By 1463, Mehmed's armies had overrun the kingdom. The Bosnian king was executed when he refused to convert to Islam. Much of the Bosnian nobility, however, chose to convert, creating a class of Muslim landowners that would characterize Bosnia for centuries. The conversion of Bosnia was one of the few instances where a significant portion of a Christian population willingly adopted Islam to preserve their social status and lands. Wallachia and Moldavia, the Romanian principalities, became Ottoman vassals. Their princes paid tribute to Mehmed and provided troops for his campaigns. One of these princes, Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler, became famous for his brutal resistance to Ottoman rule. In 1462, Vlad launched a night attack on Mehmed's camp, trying to assassinate the Sultan. The attack failed, but Vlad's guerrilla campaign and his use of terror tactics, particularly his penchant for impaling captured Ottoman soldiers, earned him a fearsome reputation. Mehmed eventually deposed Vlad and replaced him with a more compliant ruler, but the campaign in Wallachia was one of the few times Mehmed faced serious difficulty. Mehmed also turned his attention to the eastern Mediterranean. He invaded the Empire of Trebizond, the last Greek state on the Black Sea, in 1461. Trebizond, isolated and indefensible, surrendered after a brief siege. The emperor, David Komnenos, was promised safe conduct and a pension. He lived peacefully for 2 years before Mehmed, worried that David might become a focus for resistance, had him and his family executed. It was a characteristic act of ruthless pragmatism. Mehmed had promised safety, but political necessity overrode promises. The Genoese colonies in the Black Sea and the Aegean fell one by one. Mehmed understood that Genoese and Venetian commercial power could undermine his rule. He systematically reduced their fortresses and trading posts, bringing the vital Black Sea trade under Ottoman control. The Genoese colony of Kaffa in Crimea, one of the largest slave markets in the world, fell in 1475. The Italian trading empires in the east were broken. Venice, the most powerful naval state in the Mediterranean, tried to resist. The result was a long war, 1463 to 1479, that saw Ottoman and Venetian fleets clash repeatedly. Mehmed understood that he could not match Venice in naval warfare, so he struck at Venice's possessions on land. The Venetian fortresses in the Peloponnese fell. The strategically vital island of Negroponte was besieged and captured in 1470, a blow that shocked Venice to its core. When the Venetian commander refused to surrender the fortress, Mehmed personally supervised the execution of the defenders after the city fell, having them sawn in half as a demonstration of Ottoman resolve. But Mehmed's most audacious campaign was against Italy itself. In 1480, he sent an army across the Adriatic to invade southern Italy. The Ottomans captured the city of Otranto, massacred most of its population, and established a garrison. The goal was to establish a permanent Ottoman presence in Italy, a staging ground for further conquests. Europe was terrified. The Pope called for a crusade. The Italian states, usually divided by rivalry, united in the face of the Ottoman threat. Armies were assembled to retake Otranto. But before the confrontation could occur, Mehmed died. On May 3, 1481, at the age of only 49, Mehmed the Conqueror died under mysterious circumstances. He was on campaign, preparing to march east against the Mamluks of Egypt or possibly to lead the Italian campaign personally. He fell ill suddenly and died within days. Some historians believe he was poisoned, possibly on the orders of his own son Bayezid, who wanted to succeed before his father could change the succession. Others believe it was natural causes, perhaps gout or stroke, brought on by years of hard campaigning and a lifestyle that included excessive eating and drinking in his later years. Mehmed's death saved Otranto. Without the Sultan's driving will, the Italian campaign was abandoned. The Ottoman garrison in Otranto, cut off and unsupported, eventually surrendered. Italy was safe, at least for the moment. But the Ottoman threat remained. The empire Mehmed had built was too strong, too well organized, to collapse just because its founder had died. Mehmed's legacy is complex and debated even today. To the Ottomans and much of the Muslim world, he was Fatih, the conqueror, the sultan who fulfilled the prophet's prophecy and brought Constantinople under Islamic rule. He was a hero, a brilliant military commander, a just ruler who expanded the empire and brought glory to Islam. Statues of Mehmed stand in Istanbul today, and Turkish schoolchildren learn of his achievements as a proud part of their national history. To the Greeks and much of the Christian world, Mehmed was a destroyer, the man who ended the Byzantine Empire and unleashed a wave of Ottoman expansion that would threaten Europe for centuries. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is remembered as a catastrophe, the end of an era, the moment when the last remnant of the Roman Empire was extinguished. Greek refugees who fled Constantinople carried with them a hatred of the Ottomans that would fuel resistance for centuries. The memory of the sack, the desecration of churches, the mass enslavement, would not be forgotten. But perhaps the most accurate way to understand Mehmed is to see him as a man of his time, a product of 15th-century politics and warfare, who happened to possess extraordinary abilities and an iron will. He was not unusually cruel by the standards of his era. The sack of Constantinople, horrible as it was, followed the customs of contemporary siege warfare. Mehmed's execution of rivals and potential threats was standard practice for rulers who wanted to survive in the brutal world of medieval and early modern politics. What set Mehmed apart was not his ruthlessness but his strategic vision, his organizational ability, his willingness to embrace new technologies, and his absolute determination to achieve his goals. Mehmed was also a patron of learning and the arts. He spoke multiple languages, read widely, and supported scholars, artists, and architects. He commissioned histories of his reign, built magnificent mosques and palaces, and collected manuscripts and works of art from across the known world. He invited Italian artists to his court, including the painter Bellini, who created a famous portrait of the Sultan. Mehmed was curious about the world, interested in different cultures and ideas, even while he was conquering them. The empire Mehmed left to his successors was the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. It stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Crimea to the deserts of Arabia. It controlled the vital trade routes between Europe and Asia. Its capital, Istanbul, was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe. Its army was the most modern and effective military force of the age. The Ottomans would continue to expand under Mehmed's successors, reaching their greatest extent under Sultan the Magnificent in the 16th century. But the conquest of Constantinople remained Mehmed's defining achievement. The city that had stood for 1,000 years, that had seen off Persians and Arabs and Bulgars and Crusaders, had fallen to a 21-year-old sultan who refused to accept that anything was impossible. The walls that had never been breached were reduced to rubble by the largest cannon ever built. The empire that claimed descent from Augustus and Constantine the Great was ended by a ruler who combined medieval warfare with Renaissance learning, Ottoman military power with Hungarian engineering, Old World siege tactics with New World gunpowder. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. It demonstrated that no fortification, no matter how strong, could stand against determined assault backed by modern artillery. The age of the castle, of the walled city as an impregnable refuge, was coming to an end. Mehmed's guns had proven that walls were obsolete. Military engineers across Europe began to design new forms of fortification, the bastion tres Italien, that could resist cannon fire. The face of warfare was changing, and Mehmed had been one of the agents of that change. The fall of Constantinople also had profound cultural and intellectual consequences. Greek scholars, fleeing the fallen city, carried with them manuscripts and knowledge of ancient Greek texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries. These scholars went to Italy, to Venice and Florence and Rome, where they found employment teaching Greek and translating ancient texts. The influx of Byzantine learning contributed to the Italian Renaissance, the revival of classical knowledge that would transform European culture. In a sense, the fall of Constantinople helped spark the intellectual revolution that would lead to the modern world. The geopolitical consequences were equally significant. With Constantinople in Ottoman hands, the traditional trade routes from Europe to Asia were now controlled by a power that was at best neutral and at times actively hostile to Christian merchants. The cost and difficulty of Eastern trade increased dramatically. This economic pressure was one of the factors that motivated European exploration, the search for new routes to the riches of India and China. Portuguese explorers, pushing down the African coast, were looking for a way to bypass Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean. Columbus, sailing west in 1492, was trying to reach Asia without passing through Ottoman territory. The age of exploration, which would lead to European colonization of the Americas and European dominance of the world, was at least partly a response to the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. Mehmed died knowing he had achieved immortality. He had conquered the unconquerable city. He had fulfilled prophecy. He had built an empire that would last for centuries after his death. He had taken his place among the great conquerors of history, alongside Alexander, Caesar, Genghis Khan. Whatever else might be said of Mehmed II, no one could deny that he had left his mark on the world. The story of Mehmed and the fall of Constantinople is also a story about the nature of historical change. Nothing lasts forever, no matter how permanent it seems. The Roman Empire, which had endured for over 1,000 years after the fall of the West, which had survived invasions, civil wars, plagues, famines, and every disaster history could throw at it, finally came to an end on a spring morning in 1453. The walls that had protected it for a millennium were breached. The dynasty that had ruled it was extinguished. The city that had been the center of civilization fell to an invader. And yet, even in destruction, Constantinople endured in a sense. Istanbul continued, grew, prospered under Ottoman rule. The city remained a great metropolis, perhaps greater under the Ottomans than it had been in its final Byzantine years. The people continued, mixed now with Muslims from Anatolia and beyond, but still there, still living in the same streets, working in the same harbors, worshipping in buildings that had changed owners but not purpose. History does not end, it transforms. Constantinople became Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire became the Ottoman Empire. But the story, the human story of people living and working and dying in that great city, continued. Mehmed understood this. When he entered Hagia Sophia and saw the wreckage of the sack, saw the broken icons and the bloodstains, he reportedly wept, not from regret but from a kind of awe at the transience of all human achievement. He quoted Persian poetry about the impermanence of empires, about how palaces become ruins and glory turns to dust. In that moment, even in his hour of triumph, Mehmed understood that his empire too would one day fall, that his own achievements would eventually be reduced to ruins and memories. He was right. The Ottoman Empire, which seemed invincible in the 15th and 16th centuries, gradually declined. By the 19th century, it was called the sick man of Europe, kept alive only by the rivalries of the great powers who each wanted to control its dismemberment. In 1923, the Ottoman Empire formally ended, replaced by the Republic of Turkey. The Sultanate that Mehmed had strengthened and expanded was abolished. The last Ottoman Sultan went into exile, bringing to an end an institution that had lasted over 600 years. But Mehmed's Constantinople, his Istanbul, endures. The city is today one of the great metropolises of the world, home to over 15 million people, a vibrant center of culture and commerce, a bridge between Europe and Asia. Tourists from around the world visit Hagia Sophia, which has been a church, a mosque, a museum, and is now a mosque again, a building that has seen the rise and fall of empires and yet still stands. They walk the walls that Mehmed's cannon battered, walls that have been repaired and rebuilt but that still trace the same line they did in Roman times. They visit the Topkapi Palace, which Mehmed built, and see the treasures he collected. And they wonder at the story of how a young sultan, barely out of his teens, accomplished what no one else had managed. How he brought down walls that had stood for 1,000 years. How he ended an empire and began another. How he changed the world through a combination of vision, will, technology, and ruthlessness. Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed II, Fatih Sultan Mehmed. By whatever name we call him, he remains one of the great figures of history, a man who bent the world to his will and left a legacy that endures to this day. The guns that Mehmed used to batter the walls of Constantinople were, in their own way, as revolutionary as any technology before or since. They changed warfare fundamentally. Before gunpowder artillery, a strong castle or walled city could hold out indefinitely against a besieging army. After Mehmed's guns proved what was possible, no wall was truly safe. The balance between defender and attacker had shifted. Within a century, castles as defensive structures would be obsolete, replaced by new forms of fortification designed to resist cannon fire. Mehmed had ushered in a new age of warfare, and the world would never be the same. But technology alone does not explain Mehmed's success. Plenty of rulers had access to cannon. What set Mehmed apart was his systematic approach, his willingness to invest enormous resources in creating the right tools for the job, and his patience in preparing for the siege. He spent 2 years getting ready for the assault on Constantinople. He built the fortress to control the Bosporus. He assembled the largest cannon ever cast. He gathered an army of unprecedented size. He planned every detail, from the placement of his artillery to the coordination of naval and land assaults. And when the initial assaults failed, he adapted, coming up with the audacious plan to transport ships overland into the Golden Horn. This combination of thorough preparation, flexibility, and determination was what made Mehmed a great commander, not just a lucky one. Mehmed's character remains a subject of debate. He was capable of great cruelty, as his numerous executions and the sack of Constantinople demonstrate. But he was also capable of mercy and generosity. After the conquest, he protected the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, even giving him greater authority over the Orthodox population than he had enjoyed under the late Byzantine emperors. Mehmed understood that ruling a diverse empire required some degree of tolerance and pragmatism. He could not simply massacre or enslave every non-Muslim in his domains. He needed their skills, their labor, their taxes. So he created a system where Christians and Jews could live under Muslim rule, subject to certain restrictions and special taxes, but with the right to practice their religion and follow their own laws in many areas. This millet system, as it came to be called, allowed the Ottoman Empire to rule over a remarkably diverse population. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Serbs, Bulgarians, Albanians, all lived under Ottoman rule, each community with its own internal governance, united only by loyalty to the Sultan. It was not perfect, and Christians and Jews were definitely second-class subjects compared to Muslims, but compared to the religious intolerance that characterized much of contemporary Europe, where Jews were expelled or massacred and Christian heretics were burned at the stake, the Ottoman system was relatively tolerant. Mehmed deserves some credit for establishing this framework, even if his primary motivation was practical rather than ideological. Mehmed's court was a cosmopolitan place. He employed Greeks as administrators, Italians as artists, Serbians and Albanians as soldiers, Jews as doctors and translators. He was interested in Western culture and learning, even as he was conquering Western territories. This openness to different cultures and ideas was characteristic of Mehmed personally and of the Ottoman Empire more generally during its height. The Ottomans were not simply conquerors. They were synthesizers, taking the best of Byzantine, Persian, Arab, and Turkish cultures and combining them into something new. The architecture of Mehmed's Istanbul reflects this synthesis. The great mosques built by Mehmed and his successors were inspired by Hagia Sophia, with its massive dome and sense of soaring interior space. But they incorporated distinctly Islamic elements, the minarets, the geometric decoration, the calligraphy. The result was a unique architectural style, distinctly Ottoman, that can be seen as a bridge between Byzantine and Islamic traditions. Mehmed's legacy also includes the administrative and military systems he reformed and strengthened. The devshirme system, which recruited Christian boys, converted them to Islam, and trained them as soldiers or administrators, was expanded under Mehmed. This system provided the empire with a loyal bureaucracy and a formidable military force, the Janissaries, who had no ties to traditional Turkish aristocracy and owed their positions entirely to the Sultan. It was a controversial system, essentially state-sponsored kidnapping and forced conversion, but it was also remarkably effective. The boys recruited through devshirme often rose to the highest positions in the empire. Many grand viziers and provincial governors were devshirme products. In a sense, the system provided social mobility for people who would otherwise have had no opportunities. The military reforms Mehmed implemented made the Ottoman army the most effective fighting force in the Mediterranean world. The Janissaries were equipped with the latest firearms and trained in modern tactics. The Sipahi cavalry remained a powerful force. The Ottoman artillery was the best in the world, thanks to Mehmed's investment in gun founding and his willingness to hire foreign experts like Urban. The combination of traditional cavalry, modern infantry, and powerful artillery made the Ottoman army capable of fighting and winning against any opponent. Mehmed also reformed the navy, building up a fleet that could challenge Venice and Genoa for control of the Mediterranean. Ottoman galleys, rowed by slave labor and manned by skilled sailors, became a common sight in the Mediterranean. Ottoman corsairs, operating out of North African ports, raided Christian shipping and coastal towns. The Ottomans were never able to definitively defeat the Christian naval powers, but they made themselves a force that had to be reckoned with. The economic policies Mehmed implemented helped to make the Ottoman Empire prosperous. He encouraged trade, building new markets and caravanserais. He welcomed foreign merchants, including Italians, Armenians, and Jews, knowing that commerce brought wealth to his empire. Istanbul, under Ottoman rule, became once again a great commercial center, the meeting point between East and West. Goods from India, China, and Persia flowed through Ottoman territories to Europe. European goods flowed in the opposite direction. The customs duties on this trade enriched the Ottoman treasury and funded Mehmed's wars of conquest. But perhaps Mehmed's most important legacy was psychological. He had proven that the seemingly impossible could be achieved. Constantinople, the city that had never fallen, had fallen. The empire that had lasted 1,000 years had ended. This demonstrated to the Muslim world that God favored the Ottomans, that their cause was just, that continued expansion was not just possible but predestined. It demonstrated to Christian Europe that the Ottomans were a threat of the first order, a power that could not be ignored or dismissed. The fear of the Turks, as the Ottomans were called in Europe, became a constant factor in European politics for the next 2 centuries. Martin Luther, preaching the Protestant Reformation in Germany in the 1520s, warned that the Ottomans were divine punishment for Christian sinfulness. The Ottomans became a boogeyman, used by rulers to frighten their subjects and justify taxation and military levies. The dream of a crusade to recapture Constantinople became a recurring theme in European discourse, though it was never attempted. The balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted decisively in favor of Islam, and it would take centuries for Europe to turn the tide. Mehmed died in 1481, but his empire continued to expand under his successors. His son, Bayezid II, was a more cautious ruler than his father, focusing on consolidation rather than conquest. But Bayezid's son, Selim the Grim, was as aggressive as Mehmed. Selim conquered Syria and Egypt from the Mamluks, doubling the size of the empire in 8 years. His son, Suleiman the Magnificent, brought the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Hungary, besieging Vienna, and dominating the Mediterranean. Suleiman is often compared to Mehmed, and the comparison is instructive. Both were great conquerors. Both expanded the empire significantly. Both were patrons of art and learning. But Mehmed had to build the foundation. He had to prove that the Ottomans could be more than just another Turkish dynasty. He had to establish Ottoman prestige and power at a level that commanded respect and fear. He had to take Constantinople. Without Mehmed's achievements, Suleiman's would not have been possible. Mehmed was the founder of Ottoman greatness. Suleiman was its culmination. The question of what would have happened if Constantinople had not fallen is one that historians have debated endlessly. Could the Byzantine Empire have survived? Could it have been revitalized, reformed, turned into a viable state once more? The answer is almost certainly no. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire was a hollow shell. Its territory consisted of little more than the city itself. Its economy was shattered. Its population was declining. Its military was negligible. Even if Mehmed had failed to take the city, even if the siege had been lifted, Constantinople would likely have fallen within a generation to Mehmed's successor or to some other conqueror. The empire was dying of internal causes. Mehmed simply administered the final blow. But the fall of Constantinople was still a turning point, a moment when the old world ended and a new one began. The medieval world, with its continuity stretching back to ancient Rome, was severed. The Renaissance world, looking forward to modernity, began to take shape. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted. The age of European dominance over the Islamic world, which had begun with the Crusades, ended. The age of Ottoman dominance began. And all of this can be traced to a single event, a siege that lasted 53 days, a young sultan who refused to give up, and walls that finally, after 1,000 years, fell. Mehmed the Conqueror stands at the hinge of history. On one side, the medieval world, the world of Byzantium and Crusades, of feudalism and chivalry, of a Europe that looked to the east with mixture of fear and desire. On the other side, the early modern world, the world of gunpowder and global exploration, of nation-states and religious wars, of a Europe that would eventually come to dominate the globe. Mehmed was part of both worlds. He was a medieval conqueror in the mold of Genghis Khan or Timur, seeking glory and plunder through warfare. But he was also a Renaissance prince, interested in learning and art, employing the latest technology, thinking strategically about power and administration. His achievement in taking Constantinople was both an end and a beginning. It ended the Byzantine Empire and with it the last direct link to the Roman past. But it began the Ottoman era, 2 centuries of Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, during which Istanbul would be one of the world's great cities, and the Ottoman Empire would be the superpower of its region. The story of Mehmed and Constantinople is a story about how individuals can change history. One man, with sufficient will and resources and determination, can bring down a 1,000-year-old empire. One siege can change the balance of power in the world. One moment can mark the end of an age. When Mehmed looked out from the walls of his newly conquered city on the evening of May 29, 1453, surveying the destruction, the bodies, the smoke rising from burning buildings, he must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Triumph, certainly. He had achieved what no other Ottoman sultan had achieved, what many had said was impossible. Pride in his soldiers, in his commanders, in the engineers and artillerymen who had made victory possible. Perhaps some sorrow for the destruction of so beautiful a city, for the lives lost, for the civilization that had ended. And perhaps, as well, a sense of the weight of history, the knowledge that he had just done something that would echo through the centuries, that his name would be remembered long after he was dust. He was right. 6 centuries later, we still remember Mehmed the Conqueror. We still tell the story of how he took Constantinople. The city he conquered still stands, greater now than it was in his time. The walls he breached have been repaired and still trace their ancient course. The cathedral he turned into a mosque still soars above the city, its dome visible for miles, a monument to human ambition and faith in the passage of time. Mehmed's story is a reminder that empires rise and fall, that nothing lasts forever, but that human achievement endures. The Byzantine Empire fell, but its culture and knowledge spread through Europe, helping to spark the Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire rose, dominated for centuries, and eventually fell, but left behind a rich cultural legacy visible across the lands it once ruled. Constantinople became Istanbul, but the city endures, a living bridge between past and present, between Europe and Asia, between Christianity and Islam. And Mehmed himself, the boy sultan who was humiliated at 12, the young man who returned at 19 determined to prove himself, the conqueror who at 21 achieved what no one else had managed, the emperor who built an empire and changed the world, Mehmed endures as well. Not physically, of course. His body lies in a tomb in Istanbul, in the mosque he built after his conquest. But his legacy, his achievement, his story, these remain, inspiring and instructing generations who came after. In the end, perhaps that is the true measure of historical greatness. Not how long you live, or how much power you wielded, or how much territory you conquered, but whether your story continues to matter, whether people centuries later still care about what you did, whether you changed the world in ways that endure. By that measure, Mehmed the Conqueror was truly great. The boy who dreamed of glory achieved it. The sultan who wanted to be remembered succeeded beyond his wildest imaginings. The conqueror who took Constantinople ensured that his name would echo through history until history itself ends.